Hello and welcome to Accounting with Mr. H. In this video, we're going to have a look at what topics have come up in past papers for AQA Accounting Paper 2 and perhaps try to think about what topics might just come up this year in 2025. If you're enjoying the videos, please do subscribe to the channel, like, share and comment on the videos, and let me know what you'd like to see in future videos. Here we are then. This is the big tracker. So you can see what I've done here is I have shown all of the paper 2 exam papers since 2019, which was the first year of the current specification. And you can see what topics have come up in paper 2. Remember, not all of the sections are tested in paper 2. Some are in paper 1, some are in paper 2, and some are in both. So down the left-hand side is a reminder of the sections that can be tested in paper 2. And you'll see it's color-coded. If you watch my video for paper 1, it's the same idea. So I don't do the multiple choice questions and any little 3-mark written ones on here, because ultimately they can put a multiple choice question about any topic. So I just focus on the calculate questions in section A, any 6-mark written ones, and then the section B, section C questions. So if we have a little bit of a look through, let's see what immediate observations perhaps jump out. So section 1, role of the accountant. So this is the sort of question about the differences between a bookkeeper and an accountant, or the differences between between management accounting and financial accounting. Remember, though, section 1 is also in paper 1, so some of those topics have overlapped there. Types of business, again, this overlaps with paper 1, and we know that from the paper 1 exam that took place a week or so ago, we know that there were some questions on that. The double entry model, again, a core part of accounting. They tend to put double entry model questions more in paper 1 than paper 2, but ultimately, anything could come up on that. And then the rest of the topics are really the sort of more specific paper 2 topics. So let's unpick a little bit here. So section 8, the ratios, analysis of financial information. We can see that back in 2020, there was a question asking you to calculate gearing. In 2021, there was a 6-mark written question about the differences between profitability and liquidity. 2022, a little question in section A about the limitations of ratios. And then just last year in 2024, I've put it in section 8. If you've seen the paper from last year, there was a 25-mark question asking about a choice of 2 suppliers and which supplier a business should choose. Now, there were lots of things to consider in the information that was given, but in particular, they had given a number of liquidity and efficiency ratios for the 2 suppliers. So that's why I've sort of put that one alongside section 8. Immediate observations, though, I'm thinking, it's been a fair old while since gearing came up, all the way back in 2020. Interesting. Section 9, budgeting. So are there any patterns or anything to observe here? We can see a cash budget came up in 2020 and then again in 2022. Hasn't come up since. It's quite an important thing, a cash budget. Is it time for another one to pop up? Maybe a little section A question, who knows? A labour budget came up in 2021. And it came up again last year in 2024. So perhaps a labour budget won't come up this time. Perhaps if they're going to do a budget, they'd lean perhaps more towards a cash budget over a labour budget, but who knows? Written questions. So there's been a variety. Ways to improve cash flow back in 2020. Benefits of a labour budget. Usefulness of a budgeted SFP. Last year, they did ask a question about the benefits of incremental budgeting. So a little bit of a variety of written questions. What's next? Section 10, marginal costing. So all the way back in 2019, they kind of hammered marginal costing in that first paper. They talked about limitations of break even, a plan for the optimum use of scarce resources, whether they should get a new supplier to make up a shortfall in production, and there was a 25-mark question about whether they should close the loss-making department. Since 2019, as you can see, they've tended just to focus on one thing out of marginal costing pretty much every year. So in 2021, there was a marginal costing statement. In 2022, it was a 6-marker about marginal costing versus using it to set prices. And then the last couple of years, there's been a 25-mark question. 2023, it was a make or buy decision. And 2024, should they use marginal costing or absorption costing? Section 11, standard costing. You can see again at quick glance, it's come up every year in some form or another. And I think that's, quite significant because it's quite a sort of standalone topic in its own way. So it wouldn't surprise me if it didn't come up again in some form or other. So in 2019, calculate the variances and do a reconciliation. 2022, they did the same again. 2024, they did the same again. So it's probably unlikely that they'll get you to calculate variances this year, perhaps, as it's happened in that sort of pattern. Could be a little multiple choice question, calculate a quick variance. But don't forget the written questions keep popping up as well. So over the years, they've got you to analyse variances in 2019, disadvantages of standard costing in 21. Does standard costing help with motivation in 22? Interpret the variances in 2023. And then just last year, there was a written question kind of about the interrelationship of variances, whether the variances that you were given could be linked. Section 12, which is absorption and activity-based costing. I think this is quite an interesting one because in 2019, there was a small Section A question about calculating an overhead absorption rate, an OR. Then in 2020, there was a calculate question on activity-based costing and a written one about activity versus absorption costing. 2021, there was another Section A calculate on absorption costing. 22, there was a 25 marker, should they switch from activity-based to marginal? 2023, there was then another Section A, calculate on activity-based costing this time. And then last year, there were no calculate. Don't forget that there was the 25 marker last year, which I've just mentioned. I put it in Section 10 on here. There was a 25 marker last year about marginal versus absorption costing. However, I look at that and I think, okay, so when was the last time they did a calculate question on absorption costing? And it was back in 2021. So what does that mean? Who knows? But it's been a fair old while since they posed a calculate on absorption costing. So if it were me, I'd probably just be brushing up, checking I'm happy with that. Even activity based, that wasn't that calculate last came up in 2023. That was only a Section A though, so it would have been quite a small question. The last time they did a bigger calculate question on activity based costing was all the way back in 2020. So to me, Section 12, particularly as they asked, the calculate questions, absorption has only ever been a Section A question. So is it time for absorption costing to come up in Section B? Who knows? But it seems, potentially quite an important section to be just double checking you're happy with. Section 13, investment appraisal. Quite an even pattern really. Net present value and payback all the way back in 2019. And then the last 2 years, there's been net present value and payback in Section B. So it's perhaps unlikely for it to pop up again this year. Again, maybe as a multiple choice question or a small Section A question, but perhaps not so likely for Section B. In terms of 25-mark written questions, though, it hasn't been since 2022 that they did a 25-marker involving investment appraisal, perhaps making decisions. And they did that 2 years running in 2021 and 2022, but it hasn't happened since. So is it time for another 25 marker on investment appraisal? Then you come round to the other two sections that overlap with paper one, sections 17 and 18. So section 17, remember, is about predominantly the investor ratios and advantages and disadvantages of computerized systems, single versus double entry bookkeeping, that kind of thing. And then section 18 is the ethics. On here, it's only got 2021, but as I say, remember this overlaps with paper one, and ethics has been tested a number of years in paper one. So some interesting observations. As I always say, I have no crystal ball. I'm not affiliated to AQA in any way. So please make your own judgments about what may or may not come up, or what you choose to revise. Just taking it just a step further, in terms of written questions, so this slide here I shared in my video for last year, and at the time I said there's never been a written question on any of these things. The ones I've highlighted in green then came up last year, so I'm going to remove these and let's see what we're left with. So since 2019, there's never been a written question on any of these things, so it might just be worth making sure that you're happy, just in case they decide to pose a written question on these topics. So section 2, mortgages, ordinary shares, debentures. Could you explain the difference, the benefits, drawbacks of each one? There was some in paper one this year about shares, so perhaps it'd be worth just brushing up in particular on mortgages and debentures. I think this is an interesting one, the next one. Capital versus revenue expenditure and or income. They've never asked a written question on this, and to me it's kind of crying out for that to come up at some point, maybe as a little 6 marker. Why is it important to distinguish between capital and revenue expenditure, for example? I'll be making sure I'm happy with that. Section 3, reasons for adjustments. So why is it important to make adjustments for accruals, prepayments, income due, income received in advance? Section 8, capital structure ratios. Well, that's basically gearing. If you remember on the previous slide, we noted that they haven't done a calculate question on gearing for, was it back in 2019, I think 2020. So is it time for gearing to come back up? A calculate on gearing, maybe get you to interpret gearing, the significance of gearing. Section 9, a written question on the purposes of budgeting. So just double checking that you're happy with some key purposes as to why businesses budget. Last year they did a question on the benefits of incremental budgeting. So we still wait for the day that they decide to do a written question on zero-based budgeting. Given that they asked about incremental last year, perhaps they won't bother asking about zero-based this year. Stakeholders is always an interesting one because it's in section 17, all the different stakeholders that might be interested in a business. It's sort of, can they do a standalone question on it? Well, yes, they can, but what would that look like? Well, it's a bit debatable. And you could argue that, for instance, last year when they did the 25 marker on choosing a supplier, I mean, that is a stakeholder in a roundabout way, where a supplier is a stakeholder. So, they'd kind of posed it coming from that angle. And then in terms of section 18, as we know, there's been countless questions on ethics over the years, but they haven't really specifically asked about the different frameworks, the regulatory frameworks, and the different professional bodies like CIMA, the CIMA, and the CCAB. They've popped up here and there multiple choice questions, but maybe it's worth just a quick read over, checking you're happy about some of the different bodies and that what their role is, if you like. And then finally, just to do the same again on calculate questions. So this was the slide I shared last year, and I said, for instance, that they'd never done an inventory account, and then it did come up. So let's just remove that and see what we're left with. So asking you to prepare a provision for depreciation account, although I know something came up in paper one this year, but that still sort of hovers over. Asking you to calculate accounting ratios. I think that's an interesting one. Little bits have popped up in multiple choice, as I've said, and the gearing has popped up, but they haven't actually done a question asking you to calculate, for instance, the gross profit margin or profit in relation to revenue, liquidity ratios, other than in the multiple choice. Part of me thinks perhaps they wouldn't, because is it too easy to put it as a section A or section B calculate question? You know, who's to say? Maybe they'd throw it in as a little section A, a little section B, get you to calculate some ratios, and you could almost see a 6-marker following about the significance of them. But it's a judgment call. Is it too easy? Perhaps it's best just in the multiple choice. Similar with section 9, they haven't asked you to prepare a sales budget, a purchases budget, or a production budget, other than working things out in the multiple choice questions. With the budgets, they've always focused on either the cash budget or the labour budget, because at the end of the day, I suppose they're the ones where they can make them a bit trickier. But I wouldn't rule out just, double checking, just spend 10 minutes just reminding yourself of the layouts of like the purchases budget, the production budget, just in case it popped up somewhere, maybe a little section A. But if anything, I'd be inclined perhaps to look back at the cash budget, which hasn't been tested for a few years again. And then the final one is an interesting one, and this overlaps with what I mentioned a few minutes ago. Section 12, they've never asked a calculate question asking you to use absorption costing to calculate a selling price of a product. And if you remember what we said about section 12, absorption costing, calculate questions haven't come up now for a number of years. Even activity-based costing hasn't come up for a few years. So part of me is thinking it's sort of getting to the point where it's getting overdue for them to ask a calculate question using either absorption costing or activity-based costing. So I think it might be worth spending a few minutes having a look back over absorption costing, how you do things like apportionment, reapportionment, how you then calculate the ores and the 2 choices of ores, why you would choose to use the direct labour hour or the machine hour ore, how you then use the ores to work out the cost of a product, and then how then you can then calculate the selling price of a product. Equally, you might want to remind yourself about under absorption and over absorption, even an income statement using absorption costing, because it has been a while since that came up. But so activity-based costing, that's been a while. They didn't mention it last year. So again, similar, maybe just double check how you calculate, how you use cost pools and cost drivers, and then how you use them to calculate the unit cost and or the selling price. So lots of food for thought. As I say, I have absolutely no idea what will come up. So please, you make your own decisions what you are going to revise. But hopefully it's just given you a few ideas and a little bit of an insight and a few observations over what's been coming up over the last few years. And that's it. Again, thank you so much. If you've already subscribed, please do subscribe, like, share, and comment on the videos. And good luck in your Paper 2 exam.